So we're now going into a Q&A. A reminder that to ask questions, please use the Slido for questions, and we've got a lot of questions in the Slido, so that's all working. Just look in the chat of this Zoom call to find the link to the Slido if you haven't managed to get there yet. And we're on the panel for this discussion. We've got Gordon Masterton, who gave one of our keynote speeches, and then Brian, Rose, and Tom from STFC. And I've been watching the chat and the questions very carefully, and there were, I would say, two categories of question. The first set is to do with really the broad context and scene setting that Ottoline Laser and Gordon set out in their speeches. And then there's a growing number of technical and practical questions about DAFNI, which relate more to what we heard from Brian and Rose and Alex and Tom. So I'm going to take the questions in that order. So I'm going to group together a set of questions around more really to do with the policy practice divide. I should note, first of all, before I go any further, that the question that's received, or the comment that has received the most endorsement, comes from Jeffrey McBride, and it refers to the need for DAFNI to become an established national capability and funded as such. I think we'd all agree with that. We'd say that it is a national capability, and that we have some funding from UKRI, as well as through a series of projects that we'll hear about this afternoon. But as ever, longer term funding is a challenge. I think in the fiscal times that we've been through, with a series of short-term budgets and spending reviews, funding for research in general, the most challenging aspect of that has been the short time horizon. And I think we're really hoping that going into the next spending review and beyond, we'll be able to see more stability and more certainty as we look towards the future, because instability with respect to funding is one of the most debilitating things with respect to research and development of the type that you've seen. So thanks for that, Jeffrey. But to come on to the questions, we have this cluster of questions from Bridget Rosewell. Welcome, Bridget. Around who observed that there's a gap between the really challenging system of systems agenda that Ottoline set out, and Gordon as well, and actually the way in which things happen in practice. So how can and what policy can handle. And that also relates to Martin Tugwell's remarks. Welcome, Martin, as well. Around what are the necessary changes to decision making that are needed to implement this type of systems approach. And alongside that, there was a remark came in more recently from, and I'm just scanning down, from Olga, no second name there, which talked about bottlenecks in the regulatory and planning processes. So I guess that's a question for you, Gordon, about the process of bridging the gap between some of the very exciting research and innovation and systems engineering that we've heard, and what are the obstacles and enablers to that being taken up in practice. I wonder whether you have any thoughts on that one, Gordon.
Yeah, yes, I'll have a go, Jim. And fortunately, the question was asked, is this covered in the National Infrastructure Strategy? How is more effective decision-making to be achieved? And it is. There's a whole section in the strategy on exactly that, about reflecting priority outcomes more strongly and revisiting the Green Book and an updated Green Book, the Treasury Green Book, on which all major investments are based. It has already been updated with a view to being a bit less focused and obsessed with achieving a positive benefit cost ratio on a purely economic basis, but also recognising strategic impacts of interventions or major or even routine projects that have a big impact, that allow them to be favourably looked at if they meet policy objectives. It's difficult territory because Treasury will always be focused on economic bottom lines, but it's a step in the right direction to see that revision to the Green Book. There's also a very important reference to better use of data, recognising that decision making is underpinned by clear, accessible data, evidence-based decision making, if you like, and commitment to developing a national digital twin of the UK's infrastructure, systems and built environment plays entirely into the territory of UKRIC and DAFNI in particular. And so that was very encouraging to see. And other aspects like a National Underground Assets Register specifically mentioned in the National Infrastructure Strategy, and a new cost benchmarking hub and data platform is another of those. So lots of recognition that the digital world is with us, and that the more that we can make use of that and to inform decision making, then the better. But all of those are not yet in place and aspirational, but there's every prospect that they can be. I liked too the reference in the strategy to it's not all about decision making, especially in the fast moving world that we are, with having to face up to climate change adaptation. We need to be allowed to make decisions that are attempted and they look as if they may work, but actually recognising that some of them won't, and we have to be trying lots of things in parallel. So monitoring and evaluation of success of decision making is also absolutely critical, so that we can learn from both the successes but also the failures, and have permission to fail in some cases. That would be a step change, because that's not easy territory for governments to be in. The evaluation is a critical and long-term aspiration. So it's not just evaluation on completion of a piece of infrastructure, but 5 and 10 years later to see if it actually delivered the benefits that were expected of it. There's also a lot about training and development of leaders of major programs and retraining of government and civil servants into that. So I think there is a recognition that decision making is vital and key, and the proof of the pudding will be in whether we do see that over the next 5 years.
Great, thanks for that, Gordon. And before we move on to the set of technical questions for the STFC team, there was a question from Sue James around the connection in terms of DAFNI's digital twin work and the Centre for Digital Built Britain. And the answer to that is absolutely. CDBB has been convening the Digital Framework Task Group, the Digital Twin Hub, and have done a fantastic job at bringing together a community of interest in digital twins and developing standards for that, including the foundation data model. And now the work is on computational architecture for delivering digital twins, and that architecture is basically DAFNI's architecture. So we see DAFNI as being the implementation platform for all of the great work that CDBB and the DT Hub have already done to bring the community together and get them to understand the needs for and the benefits of digital twins. Sue also asked a question about spatial data, which we might come back to in particular in response to Jeremy Morley's question as well. But now let me go on to some of the technical questions. Perhaps I'll leave Brian to divide these up amongst his team. But top of the list now is the question from Peter Zupos on cybersecurity. So let's take that one on straight away.
Right, I'm trying to find it. Yeah, right, yes. Okay, right. So it's a very good question and something we are slightly wrestling with a little bit at the moment. I mean, the one level is we are in a research data center, which has quite a high level of security infrastructure around it, and we're working within that environment. So a lot of we're actually quite constrained in what we can do at times by our security officers. So we work within that framework. Having said that, it is we are a research environment, so we are tailored, if you like, tuned to doing research projects and working with research partners which sometimes don't quite have those levels of security that might have elsewhere. So it is something that we are sort of adding extra layers to. So we feel that the DSS system that we have, the DAFNI security system we have, produces a foundation for that. And we're actually working in a project at the moment which is looking just starting, or still in discussion really, which is going to look at some of these issues in much more detail. And I think it's going to be something that is obviously is going to be crucial for what we need to do in the future. But it is still sort of a little bit of a work in progress. We certainly feel that we are a good secure environment for the level of research we need to do. We're also providing connections. We're talking to the organisations such as the Office of National Statistics to try and produce connections to their secure research service, using DAFNI as a sort of conduit into that and sort of and working with that. So in those cases where we do have some very sensitive data under the control of the ONS, we can keep the data in their secure space, but and the work in a secure case as necessary, but then have them integrate and work with models and data and DAFNI platform. So those are sort of things we're looking at. So it's as I said, it's a little bit of work in progress, but it is something that we're incredibly aware of and looking at the requirements very much at the moment.
Okay, great. Thanks, Brian. We'll keep on going with the technical questions. Then there's a series of questions coming up around access and training, which we can perhaps deal with before we break. But there's a question near the top of the list here from Steve Ellis around whether each workflow spins up a virtual machine and whether there's a limit to the number of instances. At the same time, I'll ask the question from Michael Fitzmaurice, which is around whether there's any computational scalability limits for running models on DAFNI, any limits on the Docker image size.
I think I'll pass that over to Tom or Rose to answer.
Yeah, go on, go over it. Yeah, I'm happy to say that. Yeah, so starting with the virtual machine question. So the workflow doesn't spin up a virtual machine. As Brian has mentioned earlier, we use Kubernetes, and actually with the workflows, we wrap Argo around that, which Argo deals with the queuing of various different workflows and the various different steps within workflows. So it doesn't spin up a virtual machine, but it does spin up a Kubernetes pod in the background. And yes, there are limits in terms of the number of simultaneous workflows that can run at the same time, but they're based on our hardware limits. We have a certain amount of hardware that allows us to run a certain number of things simultaneously. I'm not sure off the top of my head how many things could run simultaneously, but because of Argo and because of Kubernetes, your workflow, when you execute it, if all of the hardware is busy and can't be used, then you will enter into a queue and it will eventually be run. So sometimes it might take a little bit longer to run your workflow just because it's waiting for something else to run. But we have a large amount of hardware available to us. So it's with the current number of users on the platform, that hasn't been an issue. They've all just been instantly starting. And the other question about scalability limits. So in terms of Docker image size, the limit primarily is just your internet connection. Currently, you have to upload the Docker image over HTTP, which can take some time if you have a particularly large image. It will also potentially slow down how quick your model runs on DAFNI, but that's just how Docker image sizes work. In terms of scalability or access to other resources like RAM and CPU, again, with the way that Kubernetes works, is it will automatically scale and request more resources as your model needs more resources. We do currently have an arbitrary limit of 128 gigabytes on the RAM. That's just because the largest model that we've had on the platform, or the largest model with the largest RAM requirements, has been the COVID model, and that's not needed anything more than 128 gigs. We can increase that if necessary.
Okay, great. Thanks for that, Rose. Now there's a series of questions around data. This second question here from Sophie Peachy from IOTIX around how DAFNI manages dynamic data. And then to some extent related to that are these questions around keeping data up to date. So the question from Sue James, we can see on the screen here, and also a question from Jeremy Morley about keeping the OS data up to date. So let me hand those back to you.
Tom, would you like to answer on dynamic data?
Yeah, I can try.
Or Alex?
So we have looked at this, and it's not something we're actively doing. So we're not keeping the COVID data up to date. We're not currently taking any dynamic data on board, but it's something we're exploring through the Urban Observatory stuff. So obviously they're producing sensor data that happens every 10 minutes or whatever, and we want to take that in and keep it live on DAFNI as well. So the systems that we put in place to support that will be the same systems that we put in place to support generic dynamic data in the future. So yeah, it's in the pipeline basically.
Yeah, I'd add that one of the main development activities in the new grant is looking at pilots for digital twins, and I would expect that some of those dynamic data issues would be things we've got designs would be implemented in that phase. So it's a kind of real soon now, I guess. Soon, yes. There was questions about updating data from Jeremy. I think it again is something that we do need, a process for. I mean, we do some data which we can take updates on. We take regular updates of some data from is it train timetables, isn't it? We've done that, so we know we can do it. I think it's more of a designing a process around particular data sets which are key to allow us to do that. Of course, people can do it by hand with versionings, but obviously that's not what's necessarily satisfactory. In fact, I would add to Jeremy, is on the line, very keen to have a conversation with you quite soon. So we'll be in touch.
Great, thanks for that. So just a few more technical questions coming in. There's one from Steve Browning coming quite recently about outputting for 3D VR. Maybe we'll just handle that now, and there's a couple more I can put in your direction.
I can take that one, I suppose. So it's not something we currently support with the drag and drop tool. I'm sure there are Python or R packages that would allow you to do it with Jupyter Notebook. We have also had a conversation with people from Sheffield University who are working on this tool called Wiz, which looks like it could be feasible to bring onto DAFNI, and that does 3D plots in a similar way to the drag and drop tool that I just showed. So again, something that we've thought about, but not necessarily something we're actively working on, but happy to speak to you if you've got specific requirements about that.
I think there's also here, I should mention there is hardware, visualization hardware being purchased under the DAFNI grant. It's been a little bit delayed because of delivery issues around the COVID epidemic, but some of those hardware investments in university laboratories are including things like VR suites. So it is one thing that we'll be working with those hardware platforms to see how we can deliver data to them to do the 3D visualization on the local facility.
Great. And then, well, there's the compliment from Mike Peters. That's an excellent project. So thanks for that and for the endorsement of that. Steve Ellis has talked about connecting to industrial systems with an API or an SDK. Any thoughts on that question?
Yes, so our API is actually public already, but it's not very well documented, so we wouldn't recommend people start using that as is. We are actively working on a client library, which will allow you to speak to our APIs in a much more intuitive way. So yeah, that's definitely something we're keen to do, and it's already in progress, kind of thing.
Okay, great. So there are a few more technical questions which we might pick up if we have time, but let's move on more to the now to the questions around access and training and usability of DAFNI. And top of the list now is David Borlam's question around, we've said that DAFNI is free at the point of access for UKRI researchers. And so there's a specific point about the role of Innovate UK projects in that. There's in my notes here, there's an important point which I think is also relevant with respect to access and costs, and maybe Brian will be able to say a bit more about this. But that if a commercial organization is a research partner, in a UKRI project, then they can have access to the system for the duration of the project for free, before going on to the standard charging model. But Brian, do you want to say, or perhaps set out a little bit more completely? I know we're going to say more about this afternoon, about the access arrangement.
Yeah, yes, indeed. So, you know, what we've said under this new funding is that we will provide access to researchers working in areas of interest which meet the EPSRC strategic priorities. And to my view, that doesn't necessarily mean they have EPSRC grants working on those areas. They can have grants from right across the research councils that are working in relevant areas, and that to my view would include Innovate UK. So, and indeed and as Jim just mentioned, the industrial partners working with such projects for the purpose of that research and the duration of that research. So, so I think from David's point of view, yes, I think the answer is yes. You know, we do have to think about our funding models and sustainability beyond that. So we do have to think about charging models for other usage. We've done some analysis of that and come up with a couple of models, one of which is sort of around resource usage, sheer CPU disk space scale. That isn't necessarily the most easy to judge for a project. So we've also come up with a sort of model based around sort of scale of a project you're trying to do and sort of scale of the modeling you're trying to do. So we kind of got two alternative things. We've done some comparisons with cloud services, and we would assert for what we feel we can do for a managed platform as opposed to a completely unmanaged cloud service. We feel that we offer quite reasonable value for money. So compared with those. So so we've done that analysis. So if you are interested in that sort of thing, again, please come talk to us.
Great, thanks for that, Brian. And then the next two questions are related to each other. On the one side, what are the prerequisite skills and knowledge that are required to understand and use DAFNI? And then on the flip side, what training, guidance, resources are available in general, but the question is specifically framed in terms of PhD students and DTCs, which is a very good question, because this is a doctoral training centers are a great way of getting PhD students involved in this type of research, and DAFNI is an extremely useful facility for doctoral training centers. So Brian, do you want to respond to those?
Yeah, okay. So firstly, sort of technical ability, I think I would divide sort of user communities into two there. Firstly, to actually really upload particularly models onto the platform, perhaps less so data. We're sort of pretty, we are more or less thinking that we are looking at model developers. So we have, for those people who are developing code, developing models, who have some knowledge of software engineering and coding, to upload stuff onto the platform, we need a basic knowledge of Docker. So Docker is a very well known, widely used technology now. So we would expect that, you know, we think it's reasonable to expect that software engineers would be able to use it. It's not, you know, it does take a little bit of work, but it's not so complicated. We think that the advantages of a developer having to know a little bit, use a little bit of Docker, is, you know, the pain of that completely outweighed by the alternative, which be having to adapt their own code to deal with our libraries, our APIs, our versions of programming languages, etc. Which if people use common shared computational systems, know people that can be a real bottleneck to getting people on the platform. So risk pain, but the gain is great. Now, for people who don't want to necessarily upload stuff, but want to use it, we feel that with a little bit of practice, a little bit of training and practice, that it is usable to somebody with some awareness of what models do. It's about setting parameters, it's about running workflows. We've seen the drag and drop tools. So we feel it is usable with a bit of awareness and training. We do appreciate that still might be an issue for some users looking at, who really just want a website which allows them to kind of to set a few, ask a few questions, get a few answers. That, you know, is quite hard to do as a general service, but we are considering how we might use the platform we built and some of the tools we have, like some of the underlying cloud and Kubernetes structures to support that. But that is in general quite a hard question. So moving on to the training question, there is quite a lot of documentation. One of the things I think the team has really done quite well is we've put a lot of time and effort on producing training material, sometimes documentation. I think sometimes these platforms, they miss all that, but we have quite a lot of it available. So that is all available now, so that can all be explored. It's all accessible via the system, and plus our support lines and our helplines, and our team are very, very responsive to those sorts of requests. And I mentioned in this new project, literally just started, we do want to talk to CGTs, so I would expect that we will be looking to develop training courses, getting people on detailed dives on getting people on the platform, what are the advantages, how to write how to use the data, and probably based around some hackathons as well. So we're looking at deep dives, looking at examples, trying to exploit the system. So it's a little bit watch this space, but it is one of the key things that we're trying to do in this new project. And we already have 2 or 3 centres which our partners are involved with, sort of lined up as candidates for working that with. So yeah, and interested in talking to more.
Great, thanks very much, Brian. I think we've just got time for a couple more questions. There's top of the list here, there's a question around penetration testing at STFC. And there's a good question around models that require commercial software licenses, which is something we've had to deal with already. We're already using MATLAB and commercial optimizers. So perhaps I'll pass those over to you, Brian.
So the question about penetration testing, I think I would defer to our security officers at the at STFC on that. It isn't something that we do routinely, but we have done. But it's part of the general security infrastructure that we deal with, and we certainly have very responsive. We've had this very responsive instant response, and is very actively monitoring attempts on our site. We're actually quite we you know, as a large computing facility, we do get a lot of attacks, so it is something that we have a very strong team and very strong awareness around. So what was the second question again?
It was about commercial software.
Commercial software licenses. Right, so this has come up. One or two of the models we have on the system have some commercial licenses, and you know, we've had to go into those discussions about getting the, you know, what is the cover as a license to the platform, and in those cases we may have to restrict the access to, depending on the agreement, to particular users, from particular organizations that have the access right to those things. So we would certainly look to enforce the commercial licensing. One of the systems we've had to deal with quite extensively has been MATLAB, which is a very popular commercial platform for building models on. We think we've managed to accommodate that, at least for executables on our system. So yeah, it's something we are very well aware of and have experience in. So we would need to seek arrangements that made sure that we were covered by the license and were restricted access to such tools to the right people who have access rights to those licenses.
Great. Thanks a lot. And I think actually that very systematic license checking that DAFNI enables is another of the benefits of the system. So both software providers and software users can be comfortable that they're compliant with licensing conditions. We've run out of time, I'm afraid. We will answer all of the technical questions that we received, because we recognize there are a lot of questions here, and we'll provide written answers to those with the video recording and slides of the session. I'd just like to pick up one final question which came from Jeremy Morley around what our metrics of success going forwards are going to be, and that's a great question. And I think the short answer, as in many fields, is twofold. It's around narratives and numbers, and the narratives are more important. These are the case studies of ways in which DAFNI has made a transformative difference in research terms and in terms of changing practice and delivering better and more sustainable infrastructure systems. So we're looking for all of the examples and stories and cases whereby DAFNI has done that, and there are already several, but looking to the future, we need them to be a lot more. And then the numbers part of this is around the numbers of users, the numbers of researchers and practitioners, the numbers of cases, the numbers of data and models, the numbers of publications and other non-academic outputs. And so we'll be collecting all of that up, and in the usual ways, including via research fish and other reporting mechanisms, so that we can demonstrate this growing community around DAFNI, which is really the goal of DAFNI going forwards. Anyway, I'm sorry that we haven't had time to answer everyone's questions here, but that was a really great discussion. Thanks very much indeed to our panelists, Gordon, Brian, Rose, Tom,